You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Willkommen bei Petticoats und Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. Wir sind Ihre Gastgeber Maggie und
Nicole.
And if you don't speak German, what I just said is, welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We are your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole, but I said it like Nicole question mark.
Yes, just like Nicole question mark. So I'm sure you've already seen the title of this episode, so you have a little bit of an idea of what we are talking about. But after a brief hiatus to accommodate both of our very busy schedules, I am so excited that we are back to discuss In Westen nichts Neues, or Netflix's All Quiet on the Western Front adaptation, which just arrived on the streamer in October.
Yes, we've both been very busy with, for one thing, film festivals.
So many film festivals.
Which is great because that's how we both got to see this on the big screen, which I will say, I know that this is screening in a handful of theaters in some bigger cities. If you can see this on a big screen, definitely do.
100%.
But All Quiet on the Western Front. This is a new adaptation of Erich Maria Remarque's 1929 novel. I keep getting really annoyed at people who are calling it a remake of the 1930 film. It's not. It's an adaptation of the same source material. It is in the German language, as you might have guessed by Maggie's wonderful German speaking earlier. We'll talk about that more later. It is directed by Edward. I'm already like, is it
Berger?
Berger? Okay.
Yeah.
The French speaking part of me wants to say Berger. Maggie's going to be in charge of all name pronunciations for this
Honestly,
episode.
like how the tables have turned.
Truly. And it's funny because I am like half German, but my German teacher from the one semester of German I took told me I spoke German like a French person and there was no hope for me. So it was written by Berger, Ian Stokell, and Leslie Patterson. I can say those names. The cinematography, which is gorgeous, was done by James Friend. And the music, which we'll talk about the score more in a minute because I'm obsessed with it, is by Volker Bettelman.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to let you read the cast. I'm not even going to attempt this.
Okay, so it stars Felix Kammerer, Albrecht Suka, Daniel Brühl, Sebastian Polk, Aaron Hilmer, Eden Hasenvik, and David Streisov.
Okay, yeah, several of those is not how I would have said it. But if you don't know, All Quiet on the Western Front is an anti-war story of a young German man in the German army in the last years of World War I. This is notably the first German or major German language adaptation of this novel for the screen. And it premiered at TIFF in September. It's, been to some other film festivals around the country.
Including Heidelberg Film Festival, which is where I saw it.
And it is now available to stream on Netflix. It is also notably Germany's submission for the Academy Award for Best International Feature. I've got my fingers crossed for it. Obviously, it has some steep competition because there's some really good international films this year, but I definitely have some hope for this, and I really think it's one of those foreign films that can break into other categories at the Oscars as well. So I'm really hoping that it gets nominated for Best Picture, mostly because a lot of the big theater chains will air some of the Best Picture nominees in theaters after they're nominated, and I would love for more people to get the chance to see this on the big screen.
100%. I am so hopeful for that because I would actually love to see this in an actual theater. My screening of this was in a very posh boarding school theater. So it was it was very tiny, very 1950s vibes.
I saw this in a very old school style, stage theater with a projection screen.
Yeah, same. I love that we both saw this very
which was beautiful, and it felt like the right setting for a movie set in this time period. But I was also I want to see this in IMAX.
I was also seated 3 seats over from the director. And was getting ready to interview him directly after it. I had 40 minutes between the end of my screening and my interview with him. So I was trying to take notes in this cute little notebook I had, but I kept almost dropping it because I was just so ensconced in what I was watching. But yeah, so I have been insufferable about this film. I have tweeted about it a few times, since it was announced, like who was going to be in it. So like I was aware of it. It was going to be a thing. I remember back in early 2020 when they announced that Edward Berger was going to be doing this adaptation. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I like the English adaptation. And so I was like, oh, I'm really interested to see like what a German adaptation would be. But then it like they announced not long after The Falcon and the Winter Soldier who the cast would be. And that was when like some switch was like flipped in me. So I've been insufferable. I have messaged Netflix so many times about this. At my previous job, I was like, from the second that this was announced, I was like, anything, dead silence. Then when I started working for Collider, I was like, oh, now I've got a leg up. Still dead silence. I've messaged Netflix probably upwards of 20 times about this movie. And then I got assigned it to review. And then I kept messaging Netflix because there was still no release date for it. I was trying to figure out, because I know that Netflix tends to bury its foreign cinema. Unfortunately, when it goes to screeners, people just don't get screeners for stuff that is in English language. And so I was like, I'm going to stay on top of Netflix. I still never really got any answers from them. And then it was announced at Middleburg Film Festival. And I was like, I'm there. I'm here. I am sat. I am here. And then I also got like offered to interview Edward Berger by Netflix. And I'm like fairly confident that Netflix is like aware of me. I might be on a list. I'm not entirely certain. But the PR people were very aware of my interest in this. So hi, if you're listening to this. I know you're aware of me. But this is, it's beyond just like being passionate about like the performers in this movie. It is everything about this period. Nicole and I both definitely share a love for World War I and the films about it. And if you've listened to this podcast, you've obviously like heard us talk about our shared passion for this. So I was just really excited for this film. So much so that I actually learned German. I believe I've talked about this on here probably in the episodes where we have done a heavy amount of French that Nicole has so kindly stepped up and spoken. I've said I can't speak foreign languages. I can't understand foreign languages. Turns out I actually can if I do Duolingo. This is not sponsored by Duolingo, but
it could be.
But it could be because I have been practicing German for, I think today is 304 days.
Incredible.
And I feel like I spoke fairly well there. I feel like
I was very impressed.
I watched this movie and I actually understood things without having to read the subtitles, which
that is the best feeling of all time.
Isn't it? And honestly, that was like my intention was like, I want to be able to enjoy this movie the way it was made and be able to take everything in and not have to focus so much on reading subtitles. And so I got to enjoy it. And I was like, I love this. I love like something that motivated me. I always need motivators. And so it feels like this movie was like a motivator for me. And as a film, that has been something I've looked forward to for the entirety of the pandemic. I was not at all let down by this movie. Every aspect of this just exceeded my already extremely high expectations for it. I love the way that Berger approached this and the way that he saw how war films tend to always have to position somebody as a hero, but he approached this film as a point of there are no heroes at war. And the way that it really evokes a certain uncomfortable humanity about what war does to entire generations really like spoke to me in a way that I was hoping this film would, because it's just different from any of the other war films that we've had this year. And we've been very blessed to have a lot of fun war and war games related films this year. And every single one of them was just different. And this one just struck so many chords. And also like I approached this from a very like anthropological point of view as well. There is this concept that I was fascinated with in my undergrad. And I learned more about when I got my master's degree. And it's this idea of in Small Things Forgotten. Basically, it's the small things that are left behind that hold the most impact because they're the most personal things. And oftentimes history and even films talking about history will paint really broad strokes on like the big major aspects of things, but they forget the human parts, the things that have been touched. And I really like the way that Berger unintentionally use this like motif throughout the film, because you have Franz's handkerchief from this like passing paramour named Eloise that is then like this trinket that is like deeply like yearned for from the there's a lot of yearning with like the other boys wanting to have this like trinket that he now possesses. And then you have this matchbox that Katz has that he keeps this little beetle in, and then this beetle escapes war with its life when the man that, left the beetle behind dies. And then for like Albert, it's this poster that he finds of a woman that allows him to escape the horrors of war. And Ludwig gets his glasses. And what's so interesting is Paul doesn't really have any specific thing that like anchors him. It's everybody around him who has these like little trinkets. And at the end, that like all he was left with was the people that he cared about. And then even then he left nothing behind. He's just another soldier dead in a war of men's egos, basically. And it's like the way that was constructed was just so much and like devastated me when the film ended. So that's my ramble. I could go on for hours about this movie. It's just so many details.
I love hearing you talk about this movie, first of all. That just really brings me joy. I was also so looking forward to this movie. It was definitely one of my most anticipated films of 2022. The novel is in my top 3 books of all time. And I was really hoping it was going to live up to my expectations. And I was luckily one of the first people to get to see this movie, having seen it at TIFF, which also meant that I went in like not knowing anything really about how people felt about it, which was kind of scary. But within like the first 10 minutes, I was like, oh, this is the real deal. Also, I'm going to talk about some minor spoilers here. It's a book based on a novel that's almost 100 years old.
And also based on a really true war, and you kind of know people die at war. So
exactly. But I think that like one of the cleverest things that they do in the whole movie is right at the front whenever they show you that essentially that whole idea with the uniform from the soldier who we see get killed then get reused and handed to Paul. I think all of that immediately tells you what the movie's outlook is on war, what kind of themes it wants to explore, and sort of the kind of war story that it's interested in telling. And I am one of those people that I love war films, but only if they are anti-war films.
Yeah.
And that is why I tend to like World War I movies, because inherently they are always anti-war films. Like I can't think of a World War I movie that's not like inherently anti-war in its messaging. And we've had some really good ones lately after many, many years of like not having any. Like obviously 1917, Benediction from earlier this year also sort of deals with World War I. The Journey's End adaptation from a couple of years ago that had Sam Claflin in it is honestly awesome. I really appreciate sort of the themes that these types of stories tend to address and the focus on mental health that they tend to also sort of do, because I think World War I films are almost always interested sort of in the psychology of these soldiers. And that all comes from All Quiet on the Western Front, really. Like, I'm going to talk more about the novel later, but it really is the prototype for this sort of war story that I think is what all the best war stories are. All right, that's my like pitch. If you've not read the novel, read it. It's perfect. I really think this is a perfect adaptation to the novel. We're going to talk, well, I know Maggie's going to talk a bit about a major change that they did to it, which is sort of adding in this whole section on the, I was going to say negotiation. It's not really a negotiation. The settling, let's say, of the Armistice, which I think actually really helps sort of hammer home the themes of the novel. And there's parts of the novel that are cut out, but I actually think that they make it more effective as a story. And obviously, like, you can only keep people sat in a movie theater for so long. The Irishman. But I like
Shots
everything
fired.
everything about this is so insane. Like the production design, the hair and makeup, the costume design, the script, the direction, the performances, the score. This score has stayed with me more than any other score of the whole year. I think about it constantly, even now. It is now on Netflix. I would definitely say don't listen to the score until you watch the movie, because you deserve to like experience it for the first time in context. But after you watch the movie, the score is on Netflix to listen to, and I've already started listening to it. It makes everything feel like the stakes are very high.
Also, the harmonium that is used throughout the film is so jarring. I remember feeling it in my chest. And I had to ask, because I interviewed Edward like right after I saw it. I had to ask him about like the purpose of that. And it like because there was very specific points. It didn't always come when you would expect it to come. And so I was really curious about like why he chose those times. And he said it was intended to be the times when the machinery of war was moving, whether on screen or somewhere in the distance. And so it was meant to symbolize these moments. And it was meant to feel like it, because it sometimes would appear in this like a serene moment. We were like looking at nature, and then you would get this jarring sound, and it wasn't coming in the middle of battle. It wasn't coming in the middle of these moments that like you would expect it. And so I just love that there was this very clear intent of like reminding audiences that there is so much at work far away from the battlefield.
I love that.
I was just like, oh, genius.
Genius. So much about this is genius. But yeah, that freaking score. Also, I have to point out that, you know, I'm not really one for listening to or for watching foreign films with English dubs on, but I may go back and watch this one with the English dub because George Blagden, a favorite theater actor, also, you know, film and TV actor, but Maggie and I largely know him from his
I used to talk to him on Twitter.
Theater days. Same.
DMs.
Yeah. I interviewed him whenever I lived in London. He's a great guy, but George Blagden did the English dub for the character of Paul, which is awesome. And I found out today, I was talking to my friend Patricia, hi Patricia, we know that she listens to the podcast. I found out that she's a stage manager in Vienna, and she worked on a production last year that Felix Kimmerer, who plays Paul, you know, in the movie, in the full German version, that he was in, and she was telling me all about how lovely he is. So I really like that we not only have this like connection through to Felix, but obviously we have one to George as well. So that's quite fun. I love that for us. Yeah. But I really do think, you know, this is one of my favorite movies of the year. It absolutely lived up to my very high expectations for it, if not exceeded them. It is one that I'm going to make it my personal mission to get as many people as possible to watch this year. And I really do think it's one of the best book to film adaptations I've ever seen. I think it's one of the best war films ever made. Like, I truly cannot sing its praises enough. It's one of those movies that I'm like, I have no notes. And it's also an interesting movie in that I really feel like, and I said this in my review for Awards Watch, but it really feels like the kind of movie that you don't like watch it, you experience it. Because I did, like you were saying, there were moments where I had these like full body reactions to it. And it's the kind of movie that you want to like sit down and fully give yourself over to. I am really looking forward to watching this again now that it's on Netflix. And yeah, that's like my whole pitch for like, if you've not watched it yet, watch it, tell all your friends to watch it. Maggie and I truly, it feels like this episode is the episode that we made this podcast to do. We just didn't know it at the time.
Honestly, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So much yes. I mean, the thing is that obviously like we chose Poppies because of war films. So
yeah, and because of all wars, we are both like World War I girlies. Like, yeah.
It truly like, and we had no idea when we started this. We started this, however, I will say we did start this a month after this adaptation was announced. But I think we might have started planning this. I don't think our first so it could have been like the same time, like the same week. There was a shifting in the universe.
It was like the universe found out this movie was coming, and it
was like Maggie
prompted us to make this podcast.
Maggie and Nicole is your time.
Literally, which is wild. Sometimes things happen for a reason.
They truly do.
But so first, obviously, as with any book adaptation that we talk about, I want to talk a bit about the author and about the novel itself and its release, especially because this is a really interesting story. And in doing research for this, I actually did learn things like I did not know before. And it's kind of a tragic story in some ways. But Erich Maria Remarque was actually born Erich Paul Remarque, spelled like the German way, on June 22nd in 1898 in Prussia. He was born to be a working class Roman Catholic family. His father was a bookbinder. He actually wasn't really close to his father, but he was really close with his mom, And she died at some point like during the war, from what I could figure out. And so he actually took her middle name to honor her. So that's where the Maria in his name comes from. He also changed the spelling of his last name for two reasons. One was when he was releasing this, he wanted to sort of distance his name from the novel he had put out before this, which did not do super well. But also his ancestors had been French. And so he wanted to change his name to sort of honor him. And I believe that was like, yeah. So that's why it's spelled with the Remarque, whereas like the rest of his family, and he was born with it as Remark. But so All Quiet on the Western Front was based on his personal experiences in the German army during World War I. He was drafted into the war at the age of 18. He fought on the front lines in, the trenches towards the front of the Western Front. And in July of 1917, he was wounded by shrapnel so badly in multiple limbs that he was brought back to an army hospital in Germany, and he actually spent the rest of the war recovering there and never ended up getting sent back to the front because he was not well enough to go back by the time the war ended. Post-war, he was a teacher for a couple of years until like the end of 1920. And after that, he worked a bunch of different jobs, ranging from a librarian to a journalist, kind of bouncing around doing different things. Now, he had started writing in his teens, and he published his first novel, The Dream Room, in 1920. In 1927, he serialized a novel called Station at the Horizon. And that same year, he wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, but he really struggled to find a publisher for it. And he, was going from publisher to publisher to publisher and getting turned down. And finally, it was serialized from November to December of 1928 in the German newspaper Vossische, maybe? Zeitung. For all my German heritage, I can't speak German. And then finally released as a book in January of 1929. Now, the book basically immediately becomes globally very successful. In the first 18 months it's in print, it sells 2.5 million copies in 22 languages, which is kind of insane for a writer, this young and inexperienced. It inspires war memoirs to be written, and inspires stage and theater adaptations and other novels like it to be written. And the novel becomes this international bestseller. It makes a lot of money for Remarque, but the anti-war themes catch the attention of the Nazis, who are already on the rise in Germany. And in 1933, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels labels it unpatriotic and bans it in Germany. And at that point, it was actually already banned in a couple of other countries in Europe. I know it was already banned at that point in Austria and I think the Czech Republic, or what is now the Czech Republic, because they felt it would have a demoralizing effect on their armies. But in 1938, luckily, Remarque had already left Germany to live in Switzerland in this villa that he'd bought with his earnings from the novel. But in 1938, they revoked his German citizenship. And so he and his wife, and I didn't want to go fully into this, but he and his wife, Ilsa Jutta Zambona, had been married and divorced, but then they fled together to the United States, right before the outbreak of World War II, after getting remarried just so that they can have an easier time leaving together. And then they later get divorced again. It's a very interesting story. They eventually go to the United States. In 1947, they become naturalized citizens. And he continues to write books about, novels about the German experience kind of post-war, including The Three Comrades and Flotsam. He writes quite a few other novels, but none of them ever reached the same success as All Quiet on the Western Front. He also has a younger sister who stays in Germany throughout the war and is arrested in 1943, partially because she's doing her own anti-Nazi activity. She supposedly is maybe involved in some resistance, but also partially for her connection to him. And they actually behead her. And there's this statement that they put out basically that's well, we couldn't get to your brother, but we can get to you, which is really chilling. And he apparently did really feel a lot of guilt about that. But in 1948, after the war, he returned to Switzerland and continued writing novels there. And he dies in September of 1970 in Switzerland of heart failure. And he'd had another marriage, but he also had relationships with several actresses. And the second woman he marries is an actress. But they include Hedy Lamarr and Marlene Dietrich, which is kind of insane. I was reading that, I was like, all right, damn dude, like he got around. But there are 3 now main adaptations of the novel. The first is the adaptation that was done basically immediately after it came out in 1930, which was directed by Louis Milestone, and that did win the Academy Award for Best Picture. There is a 1979 television film by Delbert Mann, and then there is the new 2022 German adaptation. So it definitely is a story that has, had really intense cultural significance, both in Europe and in the United States. But I think it's really significant that we now are finally getting like a German language adaptation of this, considering the fact that it was banned in Germany for a while, and his German citizenship was revoked because of this novel. So it's really nice sort of to see it get restored in a way to the German, sort of to the German pantheon of work.
Yes, definitely. So as Nicole alluded to earlier, one of the most fascinating aspects of this adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front is that Edward Berger opted to incorporate more historical aspects to provide further context to a lot of the things that are talked about in the book and then also talked about, obviously, in the movie. And it just really helps to provide like a much richer context for the war and what's going on beyond the trenches. And this also included subtly introducing the character of Matthias Erzberger, who was played by Daniel Brühl in this adaptation. I just want to toot my own horn for a second. So they never announced like who Daniel Brühl will be playing in this movie. And when the first photos dropped of his character, I was like, he's playing Erzberger, because like the glasses, the suit, I was like, that's who it is. Never confirmed until like the actual movie came out in TIFF. And then I was like, aha, I was right. I do know history. So I just needed to toot my horn just for that brief second that somehow I'm
amazed. Like truly well done. You were totally right.
Well, what's so funny is that like Erzberger is rarely actually discussed in like American textbooks about World War I outside of like as a footnote to the whole Armistice thing. So I just thought it was really like, I don't know. I learned it somewhere and it stuck with me. And so I was very proud of myself. So anyways, getting to actually who Matthias Erzberger is. He was born in 1875, and he started his career as a writer and actually a primary school teacher, who then later rose up the ranks of the Catholic Center Party in Germany, where he was elected as the German Reichstag in 1903, which is essentially Germany's lower house of parliament, at least up until 1918. And then a lot of things changed, and we're obviously not going to get into the ever-changing political landscape of Germany. But there is a lot that happens starting around the turn of the century, obviously up until and after World War II, which that would take like an entire episode of Petticoats and Poppies solely dedicated to discussing that. So in 1912, Erzberger became a member of the Frankenstein-Verein. Pretty sure I just mispronounced that. I practiced that all afternoon. It's one of those like lots of F's, which was like the leadership of the parliamentary party. And while he supported Germany's kind of vast army movements in 1912 to 1913, he later actually became very outspoken against what would become World War I. Erzberger actually waffled quite a bit on his opinions and his causes during this entire period of 1903 up until 1920s. It's interesting because at the time, his contemporaries largely viewed him as an opportunist, but historians now view a lot of his convictions as seeming largely genuine. And I think he's a really interesting historical figure because it shows just how like tumultuous this period of German like politics is and how people were having to adapt and having to find their own morals in a very ever-changing landscape. And he's just like a really interesting like historical figure to like research and like see all the stuff that was going on, because like at the early stages of the war, he was in charge of like foreign propaganda, especially where it related to like Catholic groups. That was really where his main focus was like, because he was very deeply Catholic, like trying to protect the like Catholics in Germany and in other places. And in 1917, Erzberger changed his political stance and became one of the leading opponents of the unrestricted submarine warfare, which caused a lot of conflict. And looking back to like the history that we discussed during our episode on the Promise, Erzberger was one of the only German politicians who is known to have tried to stop the Armenian genocide. He even traveled to Constantinople in an effort to negotiate against the actions. And unfortunately, all of those negotiations very much failed. So Erzberger's efforts to waylay the war turned him into a bit of a pariah to the upper class in Germany, but he gained great favor among the lower class citizens who were very much against the war. I'll let Nicole, of course, talk about how Erzberger ushered in the Armistice and skip to his life, his very brief life, in relative peace after the war and after World War One. So after the Armistice, opinions of him grew more and more hostile. The nationalist right wing viewed him as the man who led Germany to a humiliating and unnecessary surrender. In 1919, he did become the Minister of Finance for Germany between 1919 and 1920. He did a lot of really interesting things while he was the Minister of Finance, but one of the more interesting things was that he sought to redistribute the wealth after the war in an effort to remove the burden that the war had caused on the lower class citizens in Germany. So he created the first inheritance tax in Germany and also issued an emergency tax against the wealthy class to help offset that burden. And he became even more unpopular with the ruling class than he already had been. He also became the leader of the left wing of the Zentrum, which Joseph Wirth was also part of, pushed this idea that left is life, right is death. Due to his signing of the Armistice in 1918, Erzberger was very much regarded as a traitor by a lot of Germans, especially those on the political right. And even the press started to turn against him, making jests in print that he was not a bulletproof man, which directly led to his assassination. And Erzberger was murdered on August 26, 1921 in Bad Girschbeck. So, yeah, I will say that reading through some of this was eerie, viewing how American politics are right now, especially the divisiveness between the left and the right, seeing how people say things that they claim to be jest in the news media, and then people are attempted to be assassinated. So definitely eerie, very chilling to like view this period of history in Germany and apply it to the country that we live in today. Not something that I like to do, but this is like such a fascinating figure in history, and I like that Edward Berger looked at this and was like, this is like a character in history that like I learned about in school, and I'm going to bring him into this story to help explain the political situation that's going on. And I don't know if he knew that it was going to end up being so relevant to so many different conflicts in modern time, like when he was coming up with this in 2020. Like there's just so much about this that just too relevant. But now I'm gonna let Nicole talk about a little thing that happened on November 11th.
Just a little thing. So on November 11th, as you may have figured out, is when Armistice Day was. And so an armistice is essentially an agreement to stop fighting by both sides, rather than a surrender by one side. And it's basically supposed to be a way for a war to end without either side having to like admit defeat. This is meant to be an armistice. It's not really. It essentially gets turned into Germany surrendering for all intents and purposes, but we'll get there. But basically, by the autumn of 1918, German citizens are starting to rebel. They're exhausted. They're going hungry. And so the German side is thinking about trying to bring about an end to the war. And by September 29th, the German general and strategist Erich Ludendorff was thinking about how to come to this end of the war, especially as their allies start dropping out. In October, there's an armistice between the Ottoman Empire and the Allies fighting in the Middle East. And in only a few days after that, in October, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is basically in ruins, signs an armistice with Italy. So basically, they see that, the end is coming. Both sides, though, are really ready for the war to be over because obviously for the Allies, like France has had this war being fought on its soil for several years at this point, its citizens really need it to come to an end. Not to mention the fact that like Europe is basically running out of young men to fight at this point. But so Germany approaches the United States to request an armistice. And they're really hoping that it will be based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points that he laid out in January of 1918. Now, by this point that they come to them, Americans have been fighting in this war. Their own men have been dying on the battlefield. They're no longer as interested in these 14 points. And they're kind of like, yeah, take it up with the rest of the Allies. And so Supreme Allied Commander Ferdinand Foch is how I'm going to pronounce his name, conducted these what I want to call negotiations, but they're basically not, because they basically go to the Germans and are like, these are our terms, take them or leave them. And they're pretty harsh. It includes complete demilitarization, the evacuation of France, Belgium, and Alsace-Lorraine, like immediately, and the release of all Allied prisoners of war. And the German delegation is given 72 hours to respond. And obviously, like, nobody in the German high command wants these conditions and these terms, but Erzberger, is really part of convincing them that like they need this war to come to an end one way or another, and this is going to be the way. On November 10th, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates, and a new democratic government sends instructions to sign the armistice. And so on November 11th, 1918, the fighting on the Western Front is finally stopped. There were other places that it continued as peace negotiations continued. One thing that's interesting is the agreement is finalized at 5 a.m. that morning, but they agree that hostilities aren't going to stop until 11 a.m. so it can be the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And I actually think that says so much about this war, in that it's a lot of upper level politicians making decisions for, what they think will look cool, be important, whatever, without really thinking about the fact that that's 6 hours in between that men are dying. Yeah. In any case, responses to the armistice were varied amongst the troops. And a lot of them, they were happy that the fighting had ended, but a lot of them just didn't really believe that it was real, because especially if you think about, these are men who a lot of them have been out in the trenches, and that's just a very strange environment to be in, because you are so far removed from sort of the rest of reality that they kind of can't grasp that this is happening. And there's a American soldier, Robert Casey from the 124th Field Artillery Regiment, who wrote that day, "And this is the end of it. In 3 hours, the war will be over. It seems incredible even as I write it. I suppose I ought to be thrilled and cheering. Instead, I am merely apathetic and incredulous. There is some cheering across the river, occasional bursts of it as the news is carried to the advanced lines. For the most part, though, we are in silence. With all is a feeling that it can't be true. For months we have slept under guns. We cannot comprehend the stillness." And a lot of these soldiers talk about in their writing in the days following the armistice, that they're hearing the nature around the trenches for the first time, and things that they literally didn't realize sounded like that, because even when they'd not been under fire, they'd been able to hear it elsewhere on the line, and so they just weren't used to the silence. At the time that the war ends, it was the most costly war in human history, having claimed 8.5 million military casualties. And that doesn't include all of the citizens who were killed as part of the war, or the vast numbers of people who die of the Spanish influenza that is largely spread through soldiers returning home. The official peace treaty is signed months later at Versailles, and the harsh terms in the armistice and the peace treaty are believed to have led directly to the start of World War II. There's the whole story about how there was a young soldier in a military hospital who heard the news and was horrified that Germany had, essentially given in and capitulated to all these terms, and was determined to do something about it someday. And that man is Adolf Hitler. So, I think that you can kind of see how this leads into more catastrophes later in the century. But November 11th has become a day of remembrance in Europe for those lost in this war specifically. And in 1938, Armistice Day was made an official holiday. It's now known as Remembrance Day in the UK and Veterans Day here in the United States. But one thing that I think is really interesting, whenever I lived in London, in like the month leading up to November 11th, British people will wear a poppy on their coat to sort of signify their remembrance of the soldiers who died in this war and then other wars. But the poppy specifically is a symbol of World War I. And we also have the poppies in the name of our podcast title. So I had to point that out.
Which is exactly where it came from. And in fact, one of our early logos featured poppies a little bit more. And it actually does currently feature a small poppy in it. It's on her belt. So it is factored into our name, which is why this movie just feels like it was made for Nicole and I.
It really does.
So as with every other movie we have talked about, I get to talk about the costumes now. All Quiet on the Western Front was costumed by German costume designer Lisi Christel. She's probably best known to American audiences for costuming White House Down, A Hidden Life, and Anonymous, which she actually received an Academy Award nomination for. And I have actually seen a lot of her other work, incidentally. If you follow me on the Twitter that is slowly going down like the Titanic, I did this little thing that I called the Brühl binge last winter, where I watched 40 odd movies that feature Daniel Brühl, including 2 movies that she actually costumed. One is Lila Lila, which I highly recommend. It is an endearing film from like 2009. And then also John Rabe, which is another like war-related film. And then I also saw that she actually costumed his film that came out in 2020. So I was like, love to see somebody who sticks with a costume designer. Makes me very happy as somebody who always is just fascinated with costuming in general. And I think I've said before that war films are fairly easy to costume. You simply just have to make sure that you have the right the right uniforms for the war that you are costuming and ensure that they look right on screen. But I do think that All Quiet poses a slight challenge because trench warfare and the way that trench warfare is portrayed specifically in this film is extremely muddy and waterlogged and filthy. And so I do sympathize with the costumers and everybody who was working on costumes for this, because this was probably a very arduous process, especially if you need a character to get dirty during a take. Because then you have to have a plethora of costumes to revert back to for each take. And there's definitely a lot of this in this film. And Netflix is slowly putting out some really fantastic behind the scenes featurettes about some of the battle scenes. They haven't really touched on costuming at all, unfortunately, but I'm hoping those will come as they keep releasing new content. But it's very similar. Nicole mentioned 1917 earlier in the episode. Similar kind of premise of like the costuming requires a lot of aging and weathering and being able to reverse that in a very short window of time so that you can get these really impressive takes that this film features.
And I also think it's a film that has a lot of physicality for the actors. Yes. So definitely costuming that require that, they need to be able to move in it really naturally. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of like running scenes, and anytime that you've got sort of stiff uniforms that actors can actually move well in, I'm really impressed.
And it's really interesting that you bring that up, because I was just thinking of something that Edward Berger said during the talkback at the Middleburg Film Festival, where like when he first saw Felix, he wasn't really feeling him for Paul. And the second they had him try on the costume, he became Paul. And it was like the cost. And that's continues to reinforce this idea that I always bring up, that costumes are the most important part of a movie. And it's so often that they're overlooked. And that's why it has become a staple on this podcast that we always talk about costumes, because that is what most people see. Most audiences are not like you and I. They're not asking the director what the sound of the musical instrument making the weird noise in the movie is. They're not looking up the soundtrack on Spotify. They're not looking up the cinematographer and looking up influence. They're looking at what is visually shown to them in the medium directly in front of their eyes. And that's always costuming.
And I also think for any period film, which obviously is what we talk about on here, costuming is such a huge part of establishing the time period. which is why, we talk about it because it can do it really well or really poorly.
Yeah.
But I think
it makes or breaks the show.
It really does.
Costuming can make a bad show better, but it can make a good show worse.
Yes, absolutely.
Because
or it can make a bad show worse.
Yeah. Yeah.
Persuasion. I'm looking at you.
I was scared to say persuasion. Yeah. Same thing goes with hair. Like if you have all of your female characters with their hair down, which was not a thing at a certain period of time, I'm going to judge you forever. Little Women, I love you, but I do still think about some of that hair. Costumes are great.
Listen,
I can forgive it, but I still think about it.
I can forgive it because all of the non-marked sister women have their hair up properly.
Exactly.
I'm going to accept that it's just because they're hippies.
Exactly. That's how I rationalize.
Transcendental. Fine.
There we go. Exactly. But back to this movie and all the other ones that we've talked about on this podcast. I like that there was sparks of color used very smartly because this is a very overwhelmingly bleak film. It feels like as the war weighs on, the color is drained not only out of the faces of the soldiers, but out of the landscape, out of like just everything. And it's such a fascinating tool. And you see a lot of that also like outside of costuming and just like reflecting back on the film as a whole. You see a lot of that in the way that he intercuts with like nature and shows that even though over here, like there's death and dying and a whole generation being killed, there are still kits being born. The rivers still flow. The buds still blossom in the spring. Like there's such an interesting duality between like the bleakness of what war does, but also like this idea that like we still survive, like nature still survives. And you see some of that reflected into the costumes. Like there's like splashes of color when the boys encounter those women, that like brief little moment of like joy that they have. And then like in like the handkerchief, there's little splotches of color. And it's really interesting how they utilize color very smartly in this film when mostly you have very dirty monotone colors because uniforms are not very fun and splashy. And you see a little bit of color as well, obviously, like in the train scenes, but it's just very smartly done. And I really, really, really liked how the costumes were done for this film, even though it is mostly uniforms.
Yeah, it's everything about this film. If you can't tell, we think everything about this film is great.
So true. Like, honestly, if we didn't try to make these episodes under an hour so that people listen to them, this would be as long as the movie. It would just be like a minute by minute, shot by shot, just this movie.
Like literally, if y'all want an audio commentary on this movie, let us know. We'll do it. We'll do it.
We'll do it.
We won't. If one person says they want it, we'll do it.
Like, yes.
Should that be our like special Christmas episode? Let me know. But in any case, for now, thank you for joining us on our 45th episode of Petticoats and Poppies, but this is like the episode, I think.
This is the episode. This is it.
Yeah. Should we just be done? I don't know. No. I'm kidding. We're not done.
No, we have so much more in store for you. But
we may have peaked.
Yes. We would love to hear from you on social media while it still exists. We really want to know what you think about All Quiet on the Western Front. Nicole and I will not stop bullying everyone we know. I might have bullied somebody on Facebook today when they gave it a very like mild reaction. I was like, no, go back and rewatch it. And then I found out they watched it with the dubs on. And I was like, incorrect. Go back and watch it in German. You'll have a very different opinion on this. Yeah. I was like, no,
I'm going to watch it in English.
See, but you watched it first.
Exactly.
That's fine.
You're allowed to watch it in English on your second time.
Exactly. Exactly.
But you can find us on social media while it lasts at HGADM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find Maggie over at Maggie of the Town, and you can find me at Nicole Ackman 16 on Twitter.
And there is a chance that we will have a Tumblr set up for this podcast in due time, which I feel like actually might be a good medium for us to, share gifs from All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yeah, gifts. I wonder of who in All Quiet on the Western Front.
I have no idea. Definitely haven't shared some of him already on my newly minted Tumblr account, which you can find me on Tumblr at Maggie of the Town. I made it very easy so people can find me. But you can listen to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the Earglue Media website, and on Audible. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, and on Spotify. Every few episodes, which we have not been abiding to, we will be reading your reviews. So please leave us one if you would like to be featured. And please tell us if you would like us to give an audio commentary of All Quiet on the Western Front, because we'll do it. One person, just one person has to tell us.
Literally, we just need one person. We will be back soon with another episode, and we really mean it this time. We will be back soon as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective.
Danke fürs Zuhören.
Oh, that was dope.
You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movie.
We are dealing with some technical difficulties, so there is a pause in this recording. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.